Today we're going to talk about 5 tips by Andrew Huberman on how we can learn faster and how we can enter states of neuroplasticity. So the first tip would be that there are 3 hormones that when these are released at the same time, it is inevitable that we enter a state of neuroplasticity. And these 3 hormones would be epinephrine, noradrenaline and dopamine. Now it's interesting to know which hormones we actually need to release to enter neuroplasticity. However, this information is pretty useless if we don't actually know how we can actually make sure that these 3 hormones are released. So how are they released and when are they released? And this would lead me to the second tip. In order for neuroplasticity to occur, we need to make a lot of errors. And the reason why we need to make a lot of errors is that when we make errors, epinephrine and noradrenaline are released. And it makes sense that our nervous system would only want to change or would only change if it had to, because there's so many different bodily functions that depend on our nervous system. And if it was easy for our nervous system to change, that would actually be quite dangerous for our bodies. And therefore our nervous system would only change a little bit if it really had to, if there's a signal sent to the brain that is telling the nervous system that something needs to change because we're making errors all the time. So basically we have to get to a place with any skill we want to learn where we feel very, very frustrated because we've reached our limit and we're making all these errors. Now the problem is, of course, that this isn't necessarily very pleasant. It's very frustrating when we keep on making so many errors, which is why most people would probably give up at this point. But as Andrew Huberman explains, this is the worst thing you could do at this point. Instead, what you should do, and this would be the third tip, you want to make sure that in this state in which you're making so many errors, you want to push through even though it's so frustrating for 7 to 13 minutes, because that is the only way we can actually make sure that our nervous system and our brain actually changes. And the best thing to do when you're in this phase, and this would lead me to the 4th tip, would be if you can manage to attach pleasure to this phase. Now this sounds very counterintuitive, because how the heck are you going to manage to be both frustrated and feel good at the same time? It sounds impossible. So how can we actually manage to have a little bit of enjoyment while we're in this frustrating process? And a great way to do this would be to tell yourself while you're in this frustrating phase that this frustration is a sign of you making progress and that it's good for you in the long term. That, for example, would be a way in which you can actually make sure that you feel good and therefore release dopamine. And this is very important. As I've already explained, you need 3 hormones in order to enter neuroplasticity, and if you are only frustrated, then you're only releasing noradrenaline and epinephrine. However, you also want to make sure that dopamine is being released, because these 3 hormones have to be released at the same time, and that's why you want to kind of attach this pleasure and this enjoyment. By the way, Andrew Huberman once mentioned that one of the worst things you could do for your dopamine levels is, instead of telling yourself that you're kind of enjoying this process, the worst thing you could do would be instead telling yourself that you really, really hate the process, but you would really want the results, because this really, really undermines your dopamine levels. Now, the 5th tip would be that you want to make sure that your sleep quality is really good. In this phase in which you're making all these errors, this just triggers that your brain is going to rewire itself. But the actual rewiring of the brain actually happens during sleep. So therefore, if you want to know how to sleep better, you can watch this video here.